Welcome to Mongolian Made Easy, the podcast that teaches you how to speak Mongolian in a fun and effective way. I'm Aku, your host and guide for this learning journey. Glad you're here with me today. In this episode, we'll go over some Mongolian traditional proverbs. I'm sure some of you might be familiar, or this might be first time hearing this, so let's go and get started. I have 5 more figurative and metaphorical, and then the rest of them are more straightforward that you can even understand. So I'll start with the 5 that might be slightly confusing when you're first hearing this. So if you haven't heard of this before, I would recommend you to pause, and I'll take a nice recognizable pause after each one and then see if you can come up with your interpretation and then see if it matches with what actually it means. Alright, so the first one is brass that's near gold turns yellow. Brass that's near gold turns yellow. Or in Mongolian, алтны дэргэд гуйл шарлана. Алтны дэргэд гуйл шарлана. Alright, now you can go to the second one. If there wasn't a mound, the magpie wouldn't be sitting on it. If there wasn't a mound, the magpie wouldn't be sitting on it. In Mongolian, it's аваа босгоогүй бол шаазгаа хаанаас суух вэ? Аваа босгоогүй бол шаазгаа хаанаас суух вэ? Alright, third one is man has an older brother, a dale has a collar. Man has an older brother, dale has a collar. Mongolian translation would be хүн ахтай, dale захтай. Хүн ахтай, dale захтай. Alright, the fourth one is knife to the end of the cow's tail. Knife to the end of the cow's tail. Mongolian translation would be Ухрийн сүүлэн дээр хутга. Ухрийн сүүлэн дээр хутга. Alright, the fifth and last one. If you put gold or water in donkey's ear, it'll shake off both. If you put gold or water in a donkey's ear, it'll shake off both. In Mongolian, илжигний чихэнд алт хийсэн ч сэгсрэн, ус хийсэн ч сэгсрэн. Илжигний чихэнд алт хийсэн ч сэгсрэн, ус хийсэн ч сэгсрэн. Alright, while you're thinking about these 5 proverbs and what it might mean, I want to highlight the resource that you can use to get the translation or meaning for any new proverb that you might come across. So I highly recommend checking out the website for my podcast. It has a lot of good information that I actually have not found curated as such in anywhere else. So it's a really unique and resourceful website. So please go check it out. So when you go to my website, the first thing you'll see is a quick little intro about me and the podcast. And for every podcast, I have notes. So you can just toggle the little arrow and then you can look at all the information in there for each episode, and it's entered separately. So instead of entering transcribe like texts of everything I say, I usually try and enter it as some sort of blog post for each episode. And then after all those notes, I have created some resources. So it starts from dictionary, bookstore, YouTube channel, podcast lists, so you can practice listening Mongolian, classrooms, accessories, quick tips, etc. And also recently added some study plan if you need one. It's really just to give you an idea, but I'm not here to teach every single thing that you need, but just kind of point you to the right direction. So in the middle of these resources on the second arrow, there is links to advanced Mongolian dictionaries and other resources, and even it's pretty useful for native speakers like myself, because there are some words that I don't really use, or maybe new phrases that I've never heard of, and I also would need some help So one of these resources I use is called Mongolian Comprehensive Glossary. It's been out several years and it's pretty useful. It's the third bullet point on the website right now, and the website is Mongol, MONGOL, TOLI.mn. So mongoltöl.mn. And if you go in there, there's not only Mongolian to Mongolian translation for each word, but there's also below every word, there's cases where how these words would be used, certain phrases, and then you can even just type in there the phrase that you're trying to look for and it'll usually pull it up. But for some reason it doesn't give you any typical phrases that you see in there. You can also just type the same exact text, and it's in Cyrillics. You can put it in Google, and the first website that gets pulled up is usually mongoltöl.mn anyways. So you can either use Google or the website itself to search for your specific proverbs and phrases. So that's just a quick reference to the website and the resource. And for all other episodes, this one will also have its podcast note, and then I will link all the website links to mongoltöl.mn about these 5 that I just mentioned, so you can go see for yourself. Alright, let's get back to it. Alright, so now that you've had time to think about the meanings that it might mean for these 5 proverbs that I mentioned earlier, let's get down to business and figure out what they actually mean. So the first one is brass that's near gold turns yellow. And in Mongolian, it's алтны дэргэд гуйл шарлана. Алтны дэргэd гуйл шарлана. So next to or near gold is the word for brass. Шарлана is like turning yellow. So this proverbs mean or try to express an idea that how great of an impact of something good is. It's almost as good as just placing gold or something that's good as gold being next to something that's not gold, and it's so good that it's gonna turn something golden. Obviously this doesn't happen physically in real life, but figuratively it's tried to invoke that imagination. So that's it. Pretty simple, but it's kind of initially confusing. Alright, let's go to the next one. The second one is, if there wasn't a mound, the magpie wouldn't be sitting on it. Or in Mongolian, awa bosgogwe bol shadra hana sohwe. Awa bosgogwe bol shadra hana sohwe. So before recording this podcast, I actually tried it out with my English-speaking friend to see if this would kind of inherently make sense, and it actually didn't, because you know, in English-speaking countries we don't really talk about magpies, and why are we talking about mounds? So one thing to keep note is when you're looking at any proverbs of that certain language, you need to think about what kind of environment that they're living in, that they have been speaking for many hundreds of years, and usually it is based on their surroundings. So magpie is one of the more common birds in Eurasia, and especially in Mongolia, and there's like even tales about magpie in our children's story that's super popular that every kid knows. So magpie is just this common bird, and you would often will see it sitting on somewhere. So that's why this proverb is just so close to home, because that's something kids and everybody else just see growing up. So they took this super common occurrence and turned it into a proverb. And if you already guessed, it's a pretty simple idea. It's something about cause and effect, where the end of something always depends on how it began. So magpie would have nothing to sit on if there wasn't a mound. So, you know, it's a simple cause and effect relationship of something. And usually in Mongolian conversations and situations, we refer to it as some sort of in a negative example usually. I mean, you could use it and positive. It's pretty neutral proverb, but I've seen it more used in a slightly negative but not too evil. So for example, let's say you said to a certain person something happened and it's really bad, and now that person's constantly thinking about that and worrying about it. So you consult with your other friend, like, oh my gosh, now this person's constantly worrying about what I said. So in Mongolian case, they might cite this proverb like, well, if there wasn't a mound, magpie wouldn't be sitting on it. If you haven't told them, they wouldn't be worried about or thinking about it, so etc. So also, I guess another thing is that in Mongolian, it's pretty common to cite these traditional old proverbs in our life and situations. I know, like, we kind of rarely use this sometimes, or as a joke in English-speaking countries where, you know, sometimes it might show up. But it's not more like a lesson or like advisory or wisdom words. It's used more like a joke or just a saying. But in Mongolian, most of the proverbs are trying to be a teacher to you in a certain way, to warn you or give you a simple cause and effect that you might have not seen, etc. So those are just some side notes about Mongolian people's use of their own proverbs in day-to-day life. Alright, moving to the third one. Man has an older brother, a dil has a collar. Man has an older brother, a dil has a collar. And in Mongolian, it's hungachta dil zachta. Hungachta dil zachta. And already you can hear that there's some rhyming there. Achta zachta. So hung is a man or person. Achta is like has a brother, and ach is usually Ach's older brother. So there's a distinction between older and younger brother. If it was younger brother, it will be du. So we have two words for brother. One for older, one for younger. And dil is the traditional outfit, and collar is zach. But in English, when you have something, you use this separate word, has or have. But in Mongolian, you attach this word at the end of the noun. Instead of having brother, we say achta, and then instead of having a collar, we say zachta. So it's a one word now. So let's do a little bit of exercise here, and I think it'll be useful when you're looking at other proverbs. So I've seen it in another language in their meditational writings and etc., where they'll use some rhyming lines, and it's kind of written and placed where you need to look at what's kind of being similar to each other and what's the difference between the two lines, and that's where you draw your idea about the proverb. So for example, in this case, man has an older brother. Okay, that's kind of pretty random but obvious fact. You know, there's someone older than you always, so it doesn't really tell much on its own. But look at the next line. It has dil has a collar. So if you think about it, collar is the most top of the dil, an outfit, right? Always on the top of any outfit. So if you compare these two images where there's a man and there's a brother, and on the other side there's dil, but then it has a collar on top. So the image that is drawing here is that there's always a cap or something on top of something. For example, no matter how amazing or, you know, magnificent the dil or the outfit is, it always has a collar. Collar will always be on top of it, right? So no matter how amazing person or smart, or no matter what your status is, there's someone always older than you. Or no matter how successful you are or how skillful you are, there's always someone better than you. It's such that it's creating by having these two lines merged together. So it draws that image. So it creates the idea that there's an order and sequence in everything. It doesn't come naturally, but when you compare these two lines and do a little thought experiment, it illuminates each other. And it's a pretty straightforward idea. The next proverb, the fourth one, is knife to the end of the cow's tail. Knife to the end of the cow's tail. Or in Mongolian, ухрийн сүүлэн дээр хутга. Ухрийн сүүлэн дээр хутга. So ухрийн сүүл is cow's tail, hutag is knife, and it usually implies, even though it doesn't say it in Mongolian, ухрийн сүүлэн дээр hutag always, I don't know, in my head at least, implied the end of the cow's tail. When I first heard it myself when I was a kid, this was also pretty confusing, but that's usually how proverbs work, right? It kind of says something in a very strange way and it makes us think. And same with this one. This one means a failure of something towards the end of itself, or end of an event. So you might be thinking, oh, it's going great, but at the end it might not go that well, or it might actually fail. So this is just an implying that, like, you know, just keep an eye on something and do your best, because, you know, sometimes things start well and it doesn't end well. So just be aware of that. So that'll be the meaning of this fourth proverb. The fifth proverb is, if you put gold or water in a donkey's ear, it will shake off both. If you put gold or water in a donkey's ear, it'll shake off both. So in Mongolian, it's ilchigni chichend alt хийсэн ч сэгсрэн, ус хийсэн ч сэгсрэн. Ilchigni chichend alt хийсэн ч сэгсрэн, ус хийсэн ч sixren. So keep in mind that all these translations are my translation from Mongolian to English, just because I just don't have anywhere to go to see if there's any typical translations to these. But while I was trying to translate to English, I realized I can't really keep repeating the words. Like in reality, if I translate it word for word, if I put gold into a donkey's ear, it'll shake it off. If I put water in a donkey's ear, it'll shake it off still. Or maybe that might be a better translation. But in Mongolian, sometimes when you mention subject of the sentence and you just keep repeating the verbs and objects, in our mind the subject is still there, so now we just don't bother mentioning subject and sometimes even the object anymore, and we just keep on adding new verbs. So ilchigni chichend alt хийсэн ч sixren, and instead of ilchigni chichend being written or mentioned again, we replace alt with os, or gold, with water, and then хийсэн continues the same, sixren is the same. So, you know, that alt хийсэн sixren, os хийсэн sixren are the repeating rhyming terms, and now the object of what's being put into the ear of a donkey has changed. The grammar that's going on in this proverb, but it might also be very puzzling, like why in the first place are we putting something in a donkey's ear in the first place, right? Like, why? Isn't this pretty cruel? I mean, that's something I thought when I also first heard of this when I was little. So putting something in a donkey's ear is kind of implying, like, telling something or trying to teach someone something helpful and useful. So your gold or water is being metaphorized as like something useful or helpful to a person. And obviously the donkey is shaking it off. So for some reason it's not being, you know, used or appreciated, and it's just being neglected by the donkey, right? So that at least that's what is going on. So it kind of means that no matter how much useful or helpful things are said, a person who's unable to pay attention and put them into practice is likened to a donkey. And meaning that even if there's favorable conditions or even special good things that are available to that person, they won't be able to use them, or that they cannot distinguish between good and bad. So it's just an example or a proverb about someone who's so stubborn that they don't want to listen to anything, and they don't even have the ability to tell between what's good and bad. And, you know, if someone's telling you bad things, you shouldn't listen. But if someone's telling you good things, you should listen. But in this case, this person's not doing either. So that's likened to this very bizarre image of pouring something into a donkey's ear. in this proverb. But I hope this was pretty fun to think about. So let's go to the more straightforward ones. And I'm mentioning these straightforward proverbs in this podcast just so that if you have never heard of this, then at least now you're aware. And you can also use it in your conversation with Mongolian speakers. And if you already are familiar, this is just something to practice your pronunciation. So the first one is Ossigin owl, yossigin dagan. Ossigin owl, yossigin dagan. But sometimes, as I have probably mentioned in my earlier episodes, that some of these, and it happens in English too, like some of these letters drop just in common language, right? So in this example, osenol yosendak, osenol yosendak. So ge that's in there is dropped in a common speaker's day-to-day language. So instead of osigin ol, I would just say osinol. And instead of yosigin-dak, I would just say yosindak. So this means if you drink their water, follow their custom. Pretty straightforward. It just, if you are at someone's house and being in their territory, follow what they expect of you to do, and same case if you're visiting another country, another territory. And it doesn't have to be like different country wise, but it can also mean different families, etc. Next one is сурсан занг сураад боож болохгүй. Сурсан занг сураад боож болохгүй. Now this one, my translation is the learned behavior cannot be tied with the rope. And сурсан занг is the learned behavior, боож болохгүй is can't be tied. And then rope is kind of misleading because rope is more easy to grasp for an English speaker, but in reality, in Mongolian, it's using this leather string called sor. So we would use a lot of leather in our nomadic lifestyle and tools that we use. So it's very strong, and obviously because it's leather, it has endurance and etc. I was actually taking this as an example as I was trying to explain it to someone else earlier, that sor is this leather string that we use also to tie an animal if they need to be tied and, not need to be moved. So sor is just this kind of a rope in our imagination as an English speaker. That's just this common thing that we use to tie, but sor is this more specific to Mongolians because that's just what we use. And that's another example of how some words are kind of odd and slightly different, even though it kind of serves the same purpose in reality, but it's because of their own national or traditional context that instead of a rope, we use sor or leather string. And also, sorsang, sorad kind of rhymes in Mongolian. So that's why maybe instead of saying rope, even though we have a word for rope, which is als, but it doesn't rhyme with sorsang, so we just use sor instead. So the reason, when you look at some proverbs and you think about like, why on earth did they use this word instead when they could just use another word? Well, something that rhymes sticks to the memory better. So that's why they might have chosen that word instead. So that's just something to think about when you look at a new proverb that originated from a language that's not your own. So always think about the context and the time and the basic surrounding of those native speakers of that language. And the meaning of this proverb is the idea that it's difficult to change one's established practices. Next proverb is Yarval Darn Yadarval Ulsan. Yarval Darn Yadarval Ulsan. So my English translation is, if you hurry, you'll be cold. If you get tired, you'll be hungry. If you get tired, you'll be hungry, makes sense. But why, if you hurry, you'll be cold? Won't you be hot and sweaty because you're hurrying and walking around too fast, right? So think about it this way. You're a herder living in a yurt, and maybe it's winter because it's usually pretty cold in Mongolia anyway, and most of your job is on the outside, out in the cold. So if you hurry out to just get your work done, you might get cold because you forgot your coat. And that's, a daily case that someone just seemed to do sometimes, right? So that's just my kind of hunch where, based on just the daily activities that someone goes through in that environment. It's the idea that if you don't plan and prepare well in advance when you perform any task, you will not achieve good results. Just like, you hurry out the door and get together your sheeps together, but now you're cold because you forgot your coat and you're like 3 miles away from your yurt or something like that. Just a silly example, but I think that's kind of how it came together. Alright, next one is Тэнхлүүн явхад тэмээгээр тусалснаас твдэж явхад твнээр тусал. Тэнхлүүн явхад тэмээгээр тусалснаас твдэж явхад твнээр тусал. Alright, this is a lot of words and it might sound like a tongue twister to you. So maybe this is a good one to not just memorize but also practice your pronunciation to see if you are saying every single vowels and consonants clearly. So let me repeat it again. Тэнхлүүн явхад тэмээгээр тусалснаас твдэж явхад твнээр тусал. Тэнхлүүн явхад тэмээгээр тусалснаас твдэж явхад твнээр тусал. Alright, so this means instead of offering a camel when one's doing well, offer them a needle when one is in a flounder. So it pretty much means that, the help is meaningful when the person's actually in need. Even if what you can help with is as small as a needle, it'll be more helpful than a grand offer to help when they don't really need it. So I also have seen this proverb being used in, like a daily lifetime a lot. People would just like, hey, I want to give $20 to this person, but it won't be much, or I want to donate this, but it won't be much. People might cite this proverb and say, hey, offer them a needle when they're in a flounder. So this is just another one of the common ones that I have seen being cited during a conversation. Next one that's also pretty common is ажил хийвэл дуустал, давс хийвэл уустал. Ажил хийвэл дуустал, давс хийвэл уустал. So it was pretty hard to translate because it's pretty concise, and the best I can do is work until it's done, salt until it dissolves, but it doesn't really quite translate it exactly. But, it's an idea that if you start a task, then continue working on it until it's fully complete. And you also notice that dostal, ostal is this rhyming but totally different verb. So dostal is until it's done, or until it's finished, and ostal is like until something dissolves. Another reason why knowing and memorizing some of these proverbs is helpful is that it gives you really 2 easy words that are almost similar, sound similar, almost written similar, maybe differing 1 or 2 letters. So it helps a lot when you're trying to increase your vocabulary. So if you memorize 2 verbs or nouns that look almost the same but totally completely 2 different words with 2 different meanings, but if you rhyme them together, so like this one, dostal, ostad, or like the previous example, then you already, need to memorize maybe just 2 words, and then you know how to add or remove 1 letter, and it's in totally new another verb. So I think this is a really cool opportunity and trick to use. Once you know 1 verb, you already know 2, so it's like a buy one get one deal if you pay attention. Last but not least, ам алдвал барьж болдоггүй, агталдвал барьж болдог. Ам алдвал барьж болдоггүй, агталдвал барьж болдог. Alright, this one is if you lose your mouth, you can't catch it. If you lose your horse, you can catch it. So idea is to think carefully before what you're going to say, because if you lose your horse, you can catch it back, but if you lose your mouth, and it's a figure of speech of just saying without thinking, we usually say it as lose your mouth, or you were keeping a secret and you just kind of mindlessly talking and you talked about the secret. In Mongolian we usually say lose your mouth or amalta. So when it's already said, then you can't unsay it, because it's already out there and it's not like a horse that you can catch. Alright, so all this was some pretty common traditional proverbs that you would have seen growing up, or you would have seen your family members or friend mention it during their conversation. So it's good to know, and I encourage you to go check out that mongoltel.mn website to see if there's any more proverbs that you want to check out. There's a free ebook also on one of the free ebook website. There's a book called Brief Explanation of Some Proverbs by Irtnachirge. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're slightly more advanced in your Mongolian speaking learning journey, or even if you don't, there's a great tool, Google Translation, and other translating software or AI tools you might have at your hand. I would just copy and paste the text, because it'll be a digital version of the book anyways, and then you can see for yourself and even discover a new one that you might like and you might want to use. So let me know if you have any other tools or any other proverb, and also check out my website and see if there's any tool or resource that I'm missing that you want to share with your fellow Mongolian language learners. So thank you for tuning in. If you find this podcast helpful, please share with your friends, family, colleagues. This podcast is available on Spotify, Apple, Audible, YouTube, mBook, you name it, most of the main podcast platforms. And thank you for all the feedbacks on the previous episodes, and I will continue incorporating your feedback, so please keep them coming. There's some questionnaire for each episode and some surveys for each episode. And also you can send me your questions or any comments you have to my email, iknowmgl@gmail.com. So see you in the next one. Bye.